Some bounty hunters became famous for their quick draw. But one became a legend by going undercover for years at a time, living with outlaw gangs and learning all their secrets before taking them down. He was a cowboy detective, and the risks he took are almost too wild to believe. 1. Bass Reeves. Everyone has heard of Wyatt Earp or Wild Bill Hickok, but the story of Bass Reeves is maybe the most incredible of them all. Bass Reeves was born into slavery in 1838. He grew up in Arkansas and Texas, and he learned all the skills of the frontier. He was an expert with a pistol and a rifle, and he could track anything. More importantly, he learned the languages of the local Native American tribes. When the Civil War ended, he was a free man, and he used his knowledge of the land to become a farmer. But here's the kicker. In 1875, a famous judge named Isaac Parker, also known as the Hanging Judge, needed to clean up the Indian Territory. It was a huge, lawless area, over 75 square miles big. Parker needed the toughest and most honest men he could find to be his deputy U.S. Marshals. And he picked Bass Reeves, making him one of the very first black deputy marshals west of the Mississippi River. For over 30 years, Bass Reeves was a force of nature. He was a master of disguise. One time, he dressed up as a poor farmer with a beat-up wagon to catch two brothers. He even took a bullet out of his own hat and told them he was on the run, too. They invited him to stay the night, and when they fell asleep, he put the cuffs on them and walked them 28 miles to the authorities. He was famous for bringing his targets back alive, telling them, "Come easy or come hard." He brought in over 30 outlaws in his career. The most heartbreaking job he ever had was when he had to hunt down his own son, who had gotten into serious trouble. Any other lawman would have passed the job to someone else, but Bass said it was his duty. He tracked his son, arrested him, and handed him over for trial. He was a true legend of the law. Bass Reeves was a master of tracking and disguise, a lawman through and through. But what if a hunter didn't use a badge to get close to his targets, but instead became one of them, living a secret life inside the most dangerous gangs in the country? 2. Charlie Siringo. If Bass Reeves was the ultimate lawman on the outside, then Charlie Siringo was the ultimate spy on the inside. Born in 1855, Charlie grew up living the life of a real American cowboy. He went on long cattle drives, dealt with stampedes, and learned how to handle himself in a rough world. But he was looking for more adventure than just herding cows. In 1886, he found it when he joined the famous Pinkerton National Detective Agency. The Pinkertons were like a private police force, hired by banks and railroads to hunt down outlaws. Charlie's specialty was going undercover. He was so good at it that he spent the next 20 years living as someone else. He would change his name, his look, and his whole story to fit in with the criminals he was hunting. His most famous assignment was going after Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch. For this job, he took on the name Charlie Leon Allison and pretended to be a fiddle-playing outlaw on the run. He became so trusted that he rode with members of the gang, learning all their secrets and hideouts. He was always just one wrong word away from being discovered and having his career ended permanently. As it turns out, he even tracked the gang all the way down to South America. He sent coded messages back to the Pinkertons, letting them know where the outlaws were and what they were planning. He wrote a famous book about his life called A Cowboy Detective. In it, he talked about the lonely and dangerous life of an undercover agent. He had to be a great actor, a tough fighter, and a brilliant detective all at once. He wasn't just chasing a bounty. He was playing a long and dangerous game. Charlie Siringo hunted men by becoming their friend. But our next story is about a man so mysterious that people still argue if he was a hero or an outlaw, and the bounty on him was so huge it led to one of the goriest and most shocking proofs of capture in the history of the West. 3. Joaquin Murrieta. Now this is a story that feels more like a legend than history, and it is a dark one. During the California gold rush in the 1850s, there was a name that everyone whispered with fear and sometimes with respect: Joaquin Murrieta. The story goes that he was a Mexican miner who came to California looking for gold, but he was treated horribly by American miners. They attacked him and his family, and this injustice turned him into a Robin Hood-like figure. He formed a gang and started to fight back, robbing from the rich miners and stagecoaches. To the Mexican people in California, he was a hero, a symbol of resistance. To the state government, he was a major problem. So they put a huge bounty on his head, a prize worth thousands of dollars. To hunt him down, they formed a special group of lawmen called the California State Rangers. They were led by a tough former Texas Ranger named Harry Love. These weren't your average sheriffs, they were hired manhunters, and their only job was to find Murrieta and his gang. Here is where the story gets really wild and a little gruesome. In the summer of 1853, Harry Love and his Rangers surprised a group of Mexican men at a place called Panoche Pass. A big fight broke out, and the Rangers took down several of the men. They claimed that one of them was the famous Joaquin Murrieta. But how could they prove it to collect the bounty? Well, they did something truly shocking. They preserved the man's head in a big glass jar of alcohol. For years, that jar was put on display at museums and saloons, and people would pay money to see the head of the so-called Bandit King. Truth be told, to this day, no one is sure if the head in the jar really belonged to Joaquin Murrieta. Many people, including Murrieta's own sister, said it wasn't him. The story became a legend, a spooky tale of justice and revenge. The story of Murrieta is dark and full of mystery. But some bounty hunters weren't mysterious at all. In fact, our next manhunter was so fast and so relentless that the outlaws he chased gave him a very fitting nickname. 4. John Rippey. Not every legendary bounty hunter is a household name. Some of the most effective man-catchers were just regular guys who happened to be really good at their jobs. John Rippey was one of those guys. He operated mostly in the Pacific Northwest, in places like Oregon and Idaho during the late 1800s. He didn't have the fame of a U.S. Marshal or the backup of the Pinkerton Agency. He was often a lawman for hire, a special deputy who was called in when things got tough. He earned the nickname the Jackrabbit for one simple reason: he was incredibly fast. When he got on an outlaw's trail, he moved with amazing speed and determination. He didn't stop to rest, and he didn't give up. Outlaws knew that if Rippey was on their trail, their time on the run was about to come to a very quick end. He was known for his amazing tracking skills, able to follow a trail that other lawmen would have lost completely. But here's the thing about John Rippey. He wasn't known for being gentle. The bounties were often paid dead or alive. And Rippey had a reputation for bringing his targets in one way in particular, worse for wear. There are many stories of him getting into intense showdowns with the men he was after. He was a tough man for a tough job, and he understood the dangers of his work. He was involved in numerous close calls and standoffs, but he always seemed to come out on top. He was a perfect example of the kind of grit and toughness it took to be a bounty hunter in the Old West. He wasn't in it for the fame, he was in it to get the job done and collect his pay. His story is a reminder that for every famous lawman, there were dozens of other tough guys like John Rippey doing the dirty work of taming the West. Rippey was a straightforward manhunter who chased his bounty. But what happens when a man known for his incredible tracking skills stops working for the law and starts working for rich and powerful men who want their enemies to just disappear? 5. Tom Horn. This is where the line between a hero and a villain gets very blurry. Tom Horn was, without a doubt, one of the greatest trackers the West ever produced. He grew up learning from the Apache, some of the most skilled trackers in the world. He could read the land like a book. He could tell you how many men had passed by, if they were on foot or on horseback, and how long ago they were there, all from a few faint marks in the dirt. He was so good that the U.S. Army hired him as a scout, and he was instrumental in the final capture of the famous Apache leader Geronimo. After his Army days, he worked as a lawman and even as a Pinkerton detective, just like Charlie Sir and Go. He had a reputation for always getting his man. But then, Tom Horn's story takes a dark turn. He left the world of law enforcement and took a different kind of job. He became a range detective or a stock detective for the big, powerful cattle barons in Wyoming. What did that mean? Well, these rich cattle owners were having a big problem with smaller ranchers and homesteaders who they accused of stealing their cattle. So, they hired Tom Horn to solve their problem. And Tom Horn's solution was often final. He became a manhunter for hire. If a suspected rustler suddenly vanished, people would whisper that Tom Horn had paid them a visit. He was famous for his chilling motto, "If I shoot you, you'll be meeting my maker." He was a ghost, a shadow who would track his target for days, learn their habits, and then deliver his own brand of justice with a long-range rifle shot. He was judge, jury, and the final chapter, all in one. But here's the crazy part. This life in the shadows eventually caught up with him. In 1901, a 14-year-old boy was found taken out near his family's ranch. All the evidence pointed to Tom Horn. He was arrested and put on trial. To this day, people argue about whether he was really responsible or if he was set up by the same powerful men who used to employ him. Tom Horn's skill was tracking men down, often with a final, deadly result. But our next lawman became a legend for tracking down one specific person, the most famous young outlaw in the history of the American West. 6. Pat Garrett. Sometimes, a lawman's entire career is defined by one single event. For Pat Garrett, that event was his hunt for the legendary outlaw, Billy the Kid. Pat Garrett was a tall, lanky lawman from New Mexico. He was a former buffalo hunter and cowboy who eventually became the sheriff of Lincoln County. What's really interesting is that before he was sheriff, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, whose real name was Henry McCarty, were actually friendly. They knew each other and had even spent time gambling together in saloons. This friendship, or at least familiarity, made their story even more dramatic. When Garrett became sheriff in 1880, he made it his mission to end the chaos and lawlessness in Lincoln County. And the biggest source of that chaos was his old acquaintance, Billy the Kid. The Kid was a charming but very dangerous young man who was wanted for taking the lives of several people. Garrett put together a posse and started the long, difficult hunt for Billy and his gang. He finally captured Billy the Kid at a place called Stinking Springs. The Kid was tried and sentenced to be hanged, but Billy wasn't done yet. He pulled off one of the most daring escapes in Old West history, getting rid of 2 guards and riding out of town on a stolen horse. This made him an even bigger legend, and it made Pat Garrett look foolish. So, the hunt was back on. Garrett was determined to bring him in one way or another. He tracked him to a house in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. On the dark night of July 14, 1881, Garrett went to the house to question a friend of Billy's. As it turns out, Billy the Kid himself was in the house. He walked into the dark bedroom where Garrett was waiting. He didn't recognize the shadowy figure and asked in Spanish, "Who is it?" Pat Garrett recognized the voice. He raised his pistol and brought an end to the legend of Billy the Kid right then and there. Pat Garrett became famous overnight, but many people didn't see him as a hero. They saw him as a traitor who took down his former friend. He spent the rest of his life living in the shadow of that one dark night. Garrett was a classic Old West lawman, but the times were changing. Our next hunter was a man who brought the tough, gritty methods of the Old West into the modern age of cars and machine guns. 7. Frank Hamer. Let's fast forward a little bit, to a time when the Old West was mostly a memory. The age of 6-shooters and horses was being replaced by automobiles and automatic weapons. But there was one lawman who was a throwback to the old days, a man named Frank Hamer. Hamer was a Texas Ranger, and he was considered one of the toughest and most respected lawmen of his time. He was quiet, determined, and absolutely fearless. He started his career in the early 1900s, when parts of Texas were still very much the Wild West. He was involved in dozens of dangerous encounters and was wounded many times, but he always survived. He had a reputation for being a master strategist and an incredible marksman. He wasn't a bounty hunter in the old sense of the word, chasing a poster for a few $100s. He was a state lawman, but he was often given the special job of hunting down the worst of the worst. His most famous hunt came in the 1930s during the Great Depression. A young couple, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, were on a 2-year spree of robbing banks and small stores across the country. They were famous, and the police in several states seemed powerless to stop them. They were experts at escaping traps and weren't afraid to use their powerful automatic rifles on anyone who got in their way. So, the state of Texas hired the now-retired Frank Hamer to lead a special squad to hunt them down. Hamer was the perfect man for the job. He wasn't interested in chasing them from town to town. He studied their habits, their routes, and their families. He was a tracker, just like the old bounty hunters, but he was tracking them by the kind of car they drove and the people they visited. He figured out their patterns and set up a perfect trap on a quiet country road in Louisiana. On May 23, 1934, when Bonnie and Clyde drove down that road, Frank Hamer and his men were waiting. The ambush was sudden and overwhelming, and the crime spree of Bonnie and Clyde came to a violent end. It was the Old West way of justice, delivered in a modern world. Frank Hamer was a government man who hunted public enemies. But what happened when there was no government? When regular people had to take the law into their own hands, blurring the line between justice and revenge. 8. John X. Beidler. In the early days of the Montana Territory, around the 1860s, there wasn't much official law. Gold had been discovered, and boomtowns like Bannock and Virginia City popped up overnight. With the gold came prospectors, merchants, and a whole lot of dangerous outlaws. A ruthless gang led by a man named Henry Plummer, who was secretly the sheriff, was robbing and taking the lives of miners all over the territory. The people were terrified, and they felt like no one could protect them. So, they decided to protect themselves. A group of brave and determined citizens formed a secret society called the Montana Vigilantes. Their goal was simple: to hunt down every member of the outlaw gang and deliver swift, rough justice. And one of the most active and famous of these vigilantes was a man named John X. Beidler. He had been a lawman in other places, but in Montana he became something else, a manhunter for a secret committee. Beidler was known for his incredible endurance and his relentless pursuit of justice. He would ride for days in the freezing cold to track down a wanted man. The vigilantes didn't bother with long trials. They would hold a quick, secret meeting, and if the man was found guilty, the punishment was usually carried out with a rope and a sturdy tree branch. It was a harsh and scary form of justice, but the vigilantes believed it was the only way to bring order to the territory. John X. Beidler was at the center of it all. He was part of the group that captured and put an end to the corrupt sheriff Henry Plummer and his top deputies. He kept a detailed journal of his adventures, which gives us a rare look into the dangerous world of vigilante justice. He wasn't chasing a bounty for money. He and the other vigilantes were fighting a secret war for the soul of their community. They were walking a very fine line between being heroes and being a mob. Beidler was part of a secret group delivering harsh justice. But some manhunters weren't just tough guys, they were also performers, turning their real-life adventures into a spectacle for the whole world to see. 9. Galloping Jack O'Mohundro. Not all of the Old West's famous figures stayed in the West. Some of them brought the West to the rest of the world. That's the story of John Baker O'Mohundro, better known by his nickname, Texas Jack, or Galloping Jack. He was a real-life cowboy and scout from Virginia who went to Texas after the Civil War. He became a legendary Texas cowboy, known for his skills on the trail and his bravery. During his time as a scout for the U.S. Army, he became friends with another famous figure, William Cody, who you probably know as Buffalo Bill. Texas Jack and Buffalo Bill were two of the most famous scouts on the plains. They guided soldiers, hunted buffalo, and sometimes had to track down outlaws or fight in skirmishes. Texas Jack built a reputation as a reliable and fearless frontiersman. He was known for his tracking abilities and his cool head in a dangerous situation. He was the real deal, a man who had lived the life that people back east only read about in dime novels. But here's where his story takes a turn from the dusty trail to the bright lights of the stage. A famous writer saw the potential in these real-life heroes. He convinced Buffalo Bill and Texas Jack to come east and star in a play about their own lives called Scouts of the Prairie. Believe it or not, these rough and tough frontiersmen became actors. They would go on stage in their buckskins and reenact their own adventures for cheering crowds. Texas Jack Omohundro became a star. He was handsome, charming, and he told amazing stories of his life on the frontier, including his time as a manhunter. He showed the world what a real cowboy looked like. He even married a famous dancer and started his own acting troupe. He was one of the first people to turn the reality of the Wild West into entertainment. He was both a skilled tracker and a talented performer, a man who proved that sometimes the legend could be just as exciting as the real thing.